The rain hammered Edinburgh's streets with the kind of persistence that made tourists regret their travel decisions, and locals simply pull their collars tighter. Claire Donovan sat in her 15-year-old Ford Focus, engine off to save petrol, watching the meter on the parking space tick toward expiration. She had 4 minutes before she'd need to feed it another pound coin, and precisely 0 pounds to feed it with. Her phone showed 3:47 p.m. The solicitor's office closed at 5 o'clock. She'd driven 6 hours from Manchester with Isla sleeping in the back seat, 7 years old and blissfully unaware that their entire world balanced on whatever waited inside the granite building across the street. The letter had arrived 3 weeks ago, heavy paper stock that screamed expensive, with a return address from MacTavish Sons, Solicitors, established 1847. Dear Miss Donovan, regarding the estate of David Robert Jones, known professionally as David Bowie, deceased January 10, 2016. Our office has been attempting to locate you for the past 8 years concerning a bequest in Mr. Jones' will. Please contact us at your earliest convenience to arrange transfer of said property. Claire had thought it was a scam. Obviously a scam. She'd nearly thrown it away. Then she'd Googled the firm, found they were legitimate, called the number with shaking hands, and spoken to a woman named Mrs. McPherson, who'd confirmed, yes, David Bowie had left Claire Donovan something in his will, and yes, they'd been searching for her since 2016, and would she please come to Edinburgh to claim her inheritance? The explanation made no sense. Claire's mother, Maggie, had worked as a costume assistant during Bowie's recording sessions in Switzerland in 1995. She'd mentioned it occasionally, a brief period in her life before Claire was born, before everything became difficult. Maggie had died 2 years ago from ovarian cancer, leaving Claire with medical debt, grief, and a 7-year-old daughter to raise alone after Isla's father had decided fatherhood was too complicated and disappeared to London with a woman he'd met at the pub. Claire counted the coins in the cup holder. 87 pence. Not enough for another hour of parking. She'd have to risk it. Hope the traffic wardens were feeling generous, though Edinburgh traffic wardens were not known for generosity. Isla stirred in the back seat, small face pressed against the window, breath fogging the glass. Mummy, where are we? Edinburgh, love. Remember? I told you we were taking a trip. Is this about the castle? Isla's voice carried that careful tone children develop when they know money is tight and questions cost too much. The castle. Mrs. McPherson had said it on the phone, the word landing like something from a fairy tale. Mr. Jones left you a property in Scotland. A castle, actually. Near Stirling. It's been vacant since his death, but it's yours if you want it. Claire had asked the obvious question. What's it worth? Can I sell it? Mrs. McPherson's pause had been telling. That's complicated. You'll need to see it. There are conditions attached to the bequest. Mr. Jones was quite specific about how the property should be handled. Yes, it's about the castle, Claire said, turning to look at her daughter. We're going to meet a lawyer who'll tell us what happens next. Isla nodded, already practiced in the art of accepting what adults couldn't fully explain. She'd spent the last 18 months learning that lesson. Ever since Claire's position as a museum archivist had been eliminated in budget cuts, since they'd moved from their flat to her mother's old council house in Manchester, since meals became increasingly creative interpretations of whatever was on sale at Tesco. Claire checked her phone. 3:52. Time to move. The office occupied the 3rd floor of a building that had probably been elegant in 1847 and now just looked tired. The lift was broken, naturally, so they climbed stairs worn smooth by nearly 2 centuries of footsteps. Mrs. McPherson met them at the door, a woman in her 60s with steel-gray hair and the kind of Scottish accent that sounded like music even when discussing unfortunate circumstances. Miss Donovan, thank you for coming. And you must be Isla. They settled into chairs that probably cost more than Claire's car, in an office lined with legal books that had never been opened and paintings of men who'd been dead for a century. Mrs. McPherson arranged papers with the precision of someone who'd done this 10,000 times, but still treated each case as if it mattered. I'll be direct, she began. David Bowie purchased Killian Castle in 1983 during his Let's Dance tour. It's located approximately 20 miles northwest of Stirling, built in the 16th century, substantially renovated in the 1880s. Mr. Jones used it occasionally for recording sessions, and as a retreat between 1983 and 1995. She pushed a photograph across the desk. Claire picked it up with trembling fingers. The castle wasn't the grand fortress of tourist postcards. It was smaller, maybe 40 feet wide, built from dark grey stone that looked like it had grown from the Scottish Highlands rather than been constructed there. 3 stories, turrets at each corner, windows that were narrow slits, suggesting a time when defense mattered more than light. Surrounded by dense forest, isolated, slightly sinister in the photograph's grey afternoon light. Your mother, Margaret Donovan, worked for Mr. Jones during the recording sessions for the Outside album in 1995. According to his notes, she was pregnant at the time. Pregnant with you. He was apparently quite fond of her, felt she'd been treated poorly by the recording company regarding payment and insurance. When she returned to Manchester, he lost touch with her, but he never forgot the kindness she'd shown him during a difficult creative period. Claire's throat tightened. Her mother had never mentioned being pregnant during that job, had never suggested Bowie remembered her at all. In his will, executed in 2014, Mr. Jones left Killian Castle to Margaret Donovan or her heirs, particularly her daughter Claire, as recompense for debts unpaid and kindness unreturned. His estate has been searching for you since 2016. Your mother had moved several times, making her difficult to locate. We finally found you through national insurance records. The room felt smaller suddenly, air thick with implications Claire couldn't quite process. What's the castle worth? Mrs. McPherson's expression suggested this was the wrong question, though she answered it anyway. In its current condition, perhaps £50,000. It's been unoccupied for 8 years. The structure needs extensive repairs. The roof leaks. There's no central heating. The plumbing is Victorian. The electrical system doesn't meet current safety codes. It's listed as a historical structure, which means renovations require Historic Environment Scotland approval, which is expensive and time-consuming. Claire felt hope deflate like a punctured tire. £50,000 was meaningless when she couldn't afford to maintain or sell such a property. So it's worthless to me. I didn't say that. Mrs. McPherson leaned forward. There are complications. The property is held in trust with specific conditions. You must occupy the castle for a minimum of 6 months before you can sell it. Mr. Jones was concerned about property developers acquiring it solely for the land value. He wanted someone who would appreciate it to live there first, to understand what they'd be selling. The absurdity made Claire laugh, a sound without humor. I can't live in a castle in Scotland. I have no job, no income. I can barely afford petrol to get home. The trust includes a modest stipend. £500 monthly for living expenses during the 6-month occupancy period. After that, you're free to sell or keep the property as you choose. £500. Claire did the math automatically. Barely enough for food and utilities, nothing for repairs or emergencies. But £500 more than she currently had, and living rent-free was living rent-free, even if rent-free meant a leaking Scottish castle. Isla had been silent, studying the photograph with the intensity she brought to things that mattered. Now she spoke, voice small but certain. Can we see it? Mrs. McPherson smiled. I was hoping you'd ask. I've arranged for the keys and a site visit tomorrow morning if that suits you. They spent the night in a travel lodge that cost £43 Claire didn't have, charging it to a credit card that was already maxed. Isla fell asleep immediately, exhausted by travel and uncertainty. Claire lay awake staring at the ceiling, thinking about her mother, about Bowie, about kindness unreturned and debts unpaid. Maggie had never complained about those months in Switzerland, had never suggested she'd been treated unfairly or that someone famous owed her anything. She'd simply moved on, raised Claire alone, worked 3 jobs to keep them housed and fed, and died with medical bills that had consumed everything she'd managed to save. And now David Bowie, dead for 8 years, was offering a castle. A broken, isolated, probably uninhabitable castle, but a castle nonetheless. A place to live while Claire figured out what came next. A buffer against the immediate terror of homelessness that had been creeping closer every month. She fell asleep sometime after 3, dreaming of grey stone and narrow windows and her mother's face young and hopeful in Swiss recording studios. The drive to Killian Castle took 90 minutes through increasingly rural landscape. Mrs. McPherson followed in her pristine Volvo, while Claire's focus struggled with hills and curves, making concerning sounds that suggested the clutch was near death. They turned off the main road onto a track marked only by a weathered wooden sign, passed through forests so dense the morning light barely penetrated, and emerged into a clearing where the castle waited. It looked worse than the photograph. The stone was darker, stained by moisture and time. Several windows were broken, covered with boards that had rotted through. The roof showed obvious damage, slates missing in patches that would let rain pour directly into the interior. The grounds had gone wild, grass waist-high, trees pressing close to the walls like they were trying to reclaim what humans had temporarily borrowed. Isla pressed her face against the window. "It looks haunted." Mrs. McPherson approached with keys that looked medieval themselves, heavy iron on a ring. "The structure is sound despite appearances. Foundation is solid 16th century work. The bones are good, as they say. The door required force, swollen from moisture." It opened with a shriek of hinges onto a great hall that took Claire's breath away despite the decay. Stone walls rose 20 feet to a vaulted ceiling where wooden beams showed centuries of smoke staining. A massive fireplace dominated the far wall, large enough to stand inside. Narrow windows let in columns of dust-filled light that seemed solid enough to touch. But it was the smell that made Claire's stomach drop. Mildew, rot, mouse droppings, and underneath, something mineral and cold that suggested the building had been returning to earth for years. Mrs. McPherson's voice echoed off stone. "The main hall is the best preserved room. The upper floors show more water damage. The kitchen was updated in the 1960s, which means it's only moderately antiquated rather than completely unusable." They moved through rooms that felt like walking through someone's abandoned life. A dining room with a table that seated 12. A library where leather-bound books moldered on shelves. Bedrooms with 4-poster beds draped in sheets that had rotted to cobwebs. Isla stayed close to Claire, her usual curiosity dampened by the castle's oppressive atmosphere. The kitchen occupied the ground floor's western wing. Industrial-sized, suggesting the castle had once employed staff. The appliances were indeed from the 1960s, rounded corners and cheerful colors that looked grotesque covered in dust and mouse droppings. The sink was stained brown from decades of mineral deposits. The floor showed water damage, where pipes had burst, and no one had bothered to repair them. "There's a wine cellar," Mrs. McPherson said, almost as an afterthought. "Extensive, actually. Victorian, built when the castle was renovated. The entrance is through here." She led them to a door in the corner, hidden partially behind a pantry shelf. The door was different from the others, newer wood, installed with more care. A modern lock suggested someone had thought the space worth protecting, even as the rest of the castle fell apart. The key turned smoothly. The door opened onto stone steps descending into darkness. Mrs. McPherson flicked a light switch. Surprisingly, electricity flowed. Bulbs illuminated a staircase that curved down and to the right, stone walls pressing close enough to touch on both sides. The cellar is the most intact part of the structure. Victorian engineering. They knew how to build for permanence. Claire followed her down. Isla's hand gripped tight in hers. The temperature dropped with each step, the air becoming noticeably colder and drier. The stairs opened into a space that took several seconds to comprehend. The wine cellar stretched at least 60 feet in each direction, vaulted ceiling held up by stone pillars. Wooden racks lined every wall, floor to ceiling, designed to hold thousands of bottles. Most of the racks were empty now, but some still held wine, bottles thick with dust, labels faded to illegibility. "Mr. Jones apparently enjoyed collecting," Mrs. McPherson said, her voice echoing strangely. "Though he seems to have sold most of the collection before his death." Claire moved deeper into the cellar, drawn by something she couldn't name. The light was better than she'd expected. Electrical fixtures updated at some point to LED, bathing the space in cold white light that made everything feel like a museum display. At the far end, she found something that stopped her breath. A section of wall, maybe 10 feet wide, was different from the rest. The stones were darker, fitted with different mortar, creating a seam that ran from floor to ceiling. It looked like a door, though there was no handle, no obvious way to open it. "What's this?" Mrs. McPherson joined her, studied the wall with professional interest. "I have no idea. This is the first time I've been down here." The estate inventory listed the wine cellar but didn't mention any additional chambers. Claire ran her hand along the seam, felt the slight depression where stones met mortar. It was definitely deliberate, not a repair or structural support. Someone had built the section separately, sealed something behind it. Can we open it? The property is yours. You can do as you like, though I'd recommend a structural engineer inspect it first. Victorian construction could be unpredictable. You don't want to bring the ceiling down. They spent another hour touring the upper floors, but Claire's mind stayed fixed on that sealed wall in the wine cellar. Something about it felt significant, intentional. David Bowie had maintained this property for 33 years, had used it for recording sessions, for retreat, for whatever creative purposes required isolation and stone walls. Why seal part of the wine cellar? What was worth protecting? Mrs. McPherson left them with keys, paperwork to sign, and the solicitor's contact information for any questions. The trust stipend will begin depositing next week. First payment should arrive within 5 business days. If you need anything, don't hesitate to call. Her Volvo disappeared down the forest track, leaving Claire and Isla standing in the courtyard, staring at their inheritance. Are we really going to live here? Isla's voice carried equal parts fear and excitement. Claire looked at the castle, at the broken windows and rotting boards and roof that wouldn't survive another winter. At the isolation that would mean Isla had no nearby friends, no easy access to school, no life that resembled normal childhood. Then she thought about their council house in Manchester, about eviction notices and empty job applications, and the grinding terror of poverty. Yes, she said, making the decision as she spoke. For 6 months. Then we'll sell it and use the money to start over properly. Moving in took 3 days. They had almost nothing to move: clothes, Isla's books and toys, kitchen essentials, Claire's laptop. Everything fit in the focus with room to spare. They chose the smallest bedroom, the one with the least water damage, and a fireplace that looked functional. Claire spent the first £200 of her savings on an emergency repair to the roof directly above their room, hiring a local contractor who charged half what he should have out of either pity or amusement. The castle was freezing. Even in September, the stone walls held cold like they'd been refrigerated. Claire bought electric heaters from Argos, portable units that would bankrupt them in electricity costs but kept their one room barely livable. They cooked on a camping stove because the kitchen stove was dangerous. They bathed using water heated in pots because the Victorian plumbing produced nothing but brown sludge. Isla adapted with the resilience of children everywhere, turning the castle into an adventure. She explored every room, made forts from fallen beams, befriended the mice that scattered when she entered spaces. She asked occasionally about school, about her friends in Manchester, about when they were going back. Claire promised they'd sort out schooling soon, that this was temporary, that 6 months would pass quickly. At night, after Isla fell asleep, Claire researched the castle online. Found mentions in local history books. Killian Castle, built 1563 by Clan MacGregor, passed through various families, fell into disrepair by the early 20th century, purchased in 1983 by David Jones, David Bowie, during his serious moonlight tour. She found photographs from the 1980s showing Bowie standing in the Great Hall, looking young and impossibly cool, making the ruins seem romantic rather than desperate. She found nothing about sealed wine cellar walls or hidden rooms. 2 weeks into their occupancy, Claire received the first stipend payment. £500 appeared in her account like magic, like permission to believe this was real. She bought proper food, winter clothes for Isla, hired the contractor for 3 more emergency repairs. The money disappeared instantly, consumed by a structure that needed hundreds of thousands in renovations they'd never afford. The sealed wall in the wine cellar haunted her thoughts. She descended the stairs daily, stood in front of the different stones, tried to imagine what lay behind. The logical answer was nothing, just Victorian builders creating a storage space or sealing off a section damaged by moisture. But the wall was too deliberate, too carefully constructed to be merely functional. One evening, unable to sleep, Claire went down alone. Isla slept upstairs, secure in a nest of blankets near the electric heater. The wine cellar felt colder at night, the kind of cold that seemed to originate from the stone itself rather than the air. She brought tools, a hammer, a chisel, a crowbar, borrowed from the contractor. Stood in front of the sealed section studying it by LED light. The mortar was old but not crumbling, still holding the stones with Victorian tenacity. She positioned the chisel against a joint and swung the hammer. The sound echoed through the cellar like a gunshot. Mortar dust puffed out, but the joint held. She swung again. Again. On the fifth strike, mortar cracked and separated. A small piece fell away, revealing darkness behind the stones. Claire's heart hammered as she worked along the seam, removing mortar, loosening stones one at a time. The work took over an hour. By the end, sweat soaked her shirt despite the cold. She created a gap wide enough to fit her head through. She aimed her phone's flashlight into the opening. A room beyond. Small, maybe 10 feet square. And inside, just visible in the flashlight beam, something that made her breath catch. A vault. Modern-looking, installed long after the Victorian wine cellar was built. Black metal, approximately 4 feet tall and 3 feet wide, industrial in its simplicity. Claire pulled back from the opening, hands shaking. A vault, hidden behind a sealed wall in a wine cellar in a castle David Bowie had owned for 33 years. The implications spun through her mind, too fast to catch. She needed to get inside. The contractor arrived the next morning, a man named Douglas who'd been repairing castles longer than Claire had been alive. He studied the sealed wall with the careful attention of someone who'd seen too many amateur renovations go catastrophically wrong. You could take this down. Structure sound. This wall's decorative rather than load-bearing. But why? Claire told him about the vault, showed him through the gap she created. Douglas whistled low. Well, that's interesting. Modern installation too, within the last 40 years I'd say. Somebody wanted something protected. Can you open the wall without damaging the vault? For the right price, I can make the stones dance a jig. His quote was £800. Claire had £340 in her account. She negotiated him down to £600, paid half up front with money she'd needed for heating costs, promised the rest when he finished. Douglas worked methodically over 2 days, removing stones, stacking them carefully for potential reinstallation. He worked alone, arriving at dawn and leaving at dusk, asking no questions about why a broke single mother was tearing apart a castle's wine cellar. When he finished, the hidden room stood fully exposed. The vault dominated the space, bolted to the floor, connected to nothing. No writing, no manufacturer's mark, just black metal and a combination lock. Douglas studied it with professional interest. That's a Chubb 5000. Commercial grade. Built to resist everything short of explosives. If you don't know the combination, you're looking at professional safecracking, which costs more than what's likely inside. Claire stared at the dial. 6 numbers. Millions of possible combinations. Unless David Bowie, the man who'd left her this castle, who'd remembered her mother decades after a brief professional relationship, who'd been specific about conditions, about Claire living here before selling, who'd sealed a vault in a wine cellar and left no instructions. Unless the instructions were hidden in something only Claire could decode. She pulled out her phone, Googled David Bowie's birthday. January 8th, 1947. She approached the vault, hand trembling, and began turning the dial. 10847. The lock clicked open. Claire's legs nearly buckled. Douglas made a sound of surprise. She gripped the vault handle, pulled it open, and stared at contents that made no immediate sense. Documents. Stacks of them, protected in plastic sleeves. She pulled out the first document, carried it to better light. A letter, handwritten on heavy paper. To whoever finds this, presumably my heir. If you've opened this vault, you've proven something important. You paid attention. You remembered you thought to try. That matters. What follows matters more. In 1983, I purchased Killian Castle for £45,000, intending it as a studio retreat. What I found here changed everything. The original owner, Ian McGregor, told me a story before he died. His family had hidden something here during World War II, something valuable they couldn't risk losing to German bombing or British taxation. He'd forgotten where. Dementia had taken those memories before he could pass them to his children. But he remembered it existed. Remember the wine cellar was key. I searched for 12 years. Found nothing. Then in 1995, during the outside sessions, your mother worked for me. Margaret. She was kind when everyone else was difficult. She was pregnant and scared and trying to hold things together. She reminded me that some wealth is measured in human connection rather than what we own. After she left, I kept searching. Found this space behind the wall. Found what Ian's family had hidden. What follows is documentation of that discovery. If you've reached this point desperate enough to search, poor enough to need what I found, you deserve it more than any family who forgot where they buried their own history. Use it wisely. Remember your mother. Remember that wealth is responsibility, not escape. David. Claire's hands shook as she pulled out the next document. A handwritten ledger, dated 1943. The McGregor family inventory, listing items hidden for safekeeping during the war. Gold coins, 200 sovereigns. Silver ingots, 50, approximately 1 kilogram each. And then a single line that made Claire's vision swim. Paintings, 7, stored sealed with moisture protection. See detailed list attached. She found the attached list. Her archival training kicked in. Years of cataloging historical documents suddenly relevant. Rembrandt van Rijn, self-portrait with beret, oil on canvas, 1659. Johannes Vermeer, Lady at the Virginal, oil on canvas, 1670. Jean-Baptiste Simeon Chardin, The Kitchen Maid, oil on canvas, 1738. Francisco Goya, portrait of the Duchess of Alba, oil on canvas, 1797. J.M.W. Turner, Storm over the Highlands, oil on canvas, 1831. Vincent van Gogh, Wheat Field with Crows, preliminary study, oil on canvas, 1890. Pablo Picasso, Blue Period portrait, oil on canvas, 1903. The list continued with detailed descriptions, provenance notes, insurance valuations from 1940 that ranged from £5,000 to £50,000 per painting. Claire set the paper down carefully, breathing deliberately. She looked at Douglas, who was reading over her shoulder with an expression of pure shock. Those are real. His voice came out hoarse. According to this, yes. Authenticated, documented, hidden by the McGregor family during World War II and forgotten after Ian McGregor's memory failed. She pulled out more documents. Letters from David Bowie to various art historians and authenticators dated 1995 to 1997. Careful inquiries about paintings reportedly lost during World War II, about private collections dispersed to avoid bombing damage, about the art market for recovered masterworks. And then, more recent documents. Appraisals dated 2014, 2 years before Bowie's death. Claire's hands trembled as she read. Rembrandt self-portrait, £38 million, conservative estimate, Vermeer. £45 million Chardin, £12 million Goya, £25 million Turner, £18 million Van Gogh study, £55 million Picasso, £35 million. Total estimated value, £228 million. A separate note in Bowie's handwriting. 2014 valuations conservative. Market has increased substantially since initial estimates. Current total likely exceeds £270 million. Wine cellar vault contains paintings in original sealed cases, undisturbed since 1943. Authentication will require careful handling, professional conservation assessment. Insurance alone will cost fortune. But this wealth belongs to someone who needs it, not someone who will warehouse it. That's why I'm leaving it to Margaret's daughter. Poverty teaches humility. Desperation teaches what actually matters. Find this when you need it most. Use it better than I could have. Claire sank to the floor, back against cold stone, mind refusing to process numbers at large. £270 million. 7 paintings hidden in a Scottish castle's wine cellar. Forgotten by one family, found by David Bowie, left to her. Douglas had gone pale. Miss Donovan, this is... I don't even know what this is. It's impossible, Claire whispered. This can't be real. But the documents looked real. Felt real. The appraisals were from Christie's, from Sotheby's, from authenticators whose names Claire recognized from her museum work. The provenance traced back through the McGregor family to documented purchases in the 1800s, legal acquisitions during periods when wealthy Scottish families bought art as investment and cultural status. She stood on shaking legs, approached the vault again, looked deeper inside. 7 large cases, sealed with wax and modern environmental barriers. Temperature and moisture-controlled packaging that had probably cost thousands. Protective housing for treasures worth more than most people would earn in multiple lifetimes. What do I do? The question came out small, directed at no one. Douglas found his voice. You call experts. Christie's, Sotheby's, whoever deals with this level of artwork. And you call a lawyer, a real one, someone who handles estates worth hundreds of millions. And you call insurance companies, and probably the police, to verify none of these paintings were stolen or subject to seizure. Claire nodded, mind spinning through implications. If the paintings were real, if the authentication held, if there were no legal complications, she was standing in front of £250 million. She thought about the council house in Manchester, about eviction notices and Max credit cards, about Isla eating pasta 3 meals a day because meat was too expensive, about her mother dying with medical debt Claire was still paying off monthly in amounts that meant choosing between electricity and food. She thought about David Bowie, who'd searched for 12 years and found something extraordinary, then left it for someone who would need it desperately. Find this when you need it most. She needed it. God, she needed it. I need to see them, she said. The paintings. I need to know they're real before I tell anyone. Douglas looked uncertain. Miss Donovan, if those are genuine masterworks, opening the cases without proper environmental controls could damage them. You could destroy millions in value. Or I could open empty cases and discover this is an elaborate joke from a dead rock star. I need to know. She pulled out the first case. Larger than she'd expected, approximately 3 feet by 4 feet, surprisingly heavy. The seals looked intact, the packaging showing no water damage despite decades in the wine cellar. She set it on the floor, found a release mechanism, and carefully broke the seal. The inner case was climate-controlled packaging, the kind museums used for transporting priceless artifacts. She opened it carefully, peeled back protective layers, and there, wrapped in acid-free cloth, was the first painting. Even in the wine cellar's cold LED light, even covered in protective material, Claire could see the quality. The brushwork, the colors that seemed to glow from within the canvas. She was looking at something created by a master, something that had survived centuries. She unwrapped it fully, hands trembling. The painting showed an old man, face weathered and deeply human, wearing a beret, staring out from the canvas with eyes that seemed to track her movement. In the lower right corner, barely visible, a signature. Rembrandt, 1659. Claire had worked in archives, had handled historical documents, valuable manuscripts, but she'd never held something like this. Never been alone with a piece of work so extraordinary it existed in textbooks and museum catalogs and the collective human memory of what great art looked like. Douglas made a sound like a strangled gasp. That's actually real, Claire finished. It's real. They opened the second case. Vermeer. A woman at a keyboard instrument, late afternoon light streaming through a window, rendering everything with the photographic precision Vermeer had somehow achieved with paint and canvas in 1670. The third. Chardin. A kitchen, made surrounded by copper pots, the painting glowing with domestic warmth. Fourth. Goya. The Duchess of Alba, imperious and beautiful, captured in the moment before Spanish society collapsed into war. Fifth. Turner. A Scottish landscape consumed by storm, the painting almost abstract in its representation of light and atmosphere. Sixth. Van Gogh. Not the famous final painting of wheat fields and crows, but a study for it, recognizable in every brushstroke. The swirling sky, the dark birds, the golden wheat bent by wind that seemed to blow off the canvas. Seventh. Picasso. A gaunt figure from the blue period, so melancholy Claire felt it in her chest. 7 paintings. Real. Undamaged. Worth £250 million, sitting on the floor of a wine cellar in a castle she'd inherited from a man who died 8 years ago. Douglas backed away slowly, like the paintings might explode. I need to leave. I need to not know about this. Miss Donovan, whatever you do next, I was never here. I opened a wall. That's all. I never saw what was inside. Douglas. No. This is too big. People kill for things like this. I have a family. I can't be involved. He left quickly, climbing the stairs without looking back. Claire heard the castle's front door open and close, heard his van's engine start and fade into distance. She was alone with £270 million in art. She carefully rewrapped each painting, returned them to their cases, sealed everything as well as she could, and climbed upstairs to their bedroom where Isla slept peacefully, unaware her life had just transformed in ways she couldn't possibly understand. Claire didn't sleep that night. She sat with her laptop, researching, planning, trying to understand what came next. The paintings couldn't stay in the wine cellar. They needed professional authentication, conservation assessment, insurance that would cost thousands monthly, security that required systems the castle didn't have. She needed lawyers, multiple lawyers, someone to verify ownership, to navigate the maze of Scottish property law, to ensure the MacGregor family had no remaining claim, to handle taxes that would consume millions before she saw any money. She needed authenticators from Christie's or Sotheby's or both, experts who could verify what Bowie's 2014 appraisals had claimed, who could document provenance, who could prepare the paintings for eventual sale. She needed to tell no one, absolutely no one. Because Douglas was right, people killed for less than this. Morning came gray and cold. Isla woke, asking for breakfast. Claire made porridge on the camping stove, moving on autopilot, mind consumed by calculations of value and risk and transformation. "Mummy, you look strange. Are you sick?" "Just tired, love. Didn't sleep well." She waited until Isla was dressed and occupied with books before calling Mrs. McPherson. The solicitor answered on the second ring. "Miss Donovan, is everything all right? I need to speak with you. Privately. As soon as possible. And I need recommendations for lawyers who handle extremely high-value estates." The pause was eloquent. "What have you found? I'd rather not discuss it over the phone. Can you come to the castle? I'll be there in 2 hours." Mrs. McPherson arrived at noon, her Volvo crunching over the overgrown courtyard. She entered the castle with professional composure, but Claire could see the curiosity beneath the calm. "Show me." They descended to the wine cellar. Claire led her to the opened wall, the vault, the 7 cases. She explained about Bowie's letter, about the MacGregor family hiding their art collection during World War II, about appraisals that suggested £270 million in value. Mrs. McPherson listened without interruption, her expression remaining neutral, until Claire opened the first case and showed her the Rembrandt. Then the solicitor's composure cracked. She stared at the painting for a full 30 seconds before speaking. "Dear God, that's real," Claire finished. "All 7 are real, as far as I can tell. I need authentication, but everything suggests Bowie found something extraordinary and left it specifically for me." Mrs. McPherson sat down carefully on one of the wine cellar's built-in benches. I've handled estate law for 40 years. I've never encountered anything remotely like this. What do I do?" The solicitor took a breath, visibly pulling herself together. "First, we secure these paintings immediately. Proper insurance, climate-controlled storage, professional security. Second, we verify ownership, ensure the MacGregor family has no remaining claim, that the paintings weren't subject to seizure during World War II, that they're clean of any legal complications. Third, we authenticate. Christie's has a department that handles discoveries of this magnitude. They'll need months to verify, conserve, and prepare for auction. And then you become extraordinarily wealthy. But Miss Donovan, you need to understand something crucial. This process will take time. A year minimum, possibly 2. The art world moves slowly for treasures of this magnitude. And during that time, you'll be vulnerable. People will find out. The media will be relentless. You'll need security, legal protection, financial advisors who understand how to manage sudden wealth without losing it. Claire felt the weight of those words settle into her bones. "I just wanted somewhere to live. 6 months in a castle, then sell it for £50,000 and start over. That would have been enough." Mrs. McPherson's expression softened. "David Bowie left you something far more than shelter. He left you freedom. Complete, transformative freedom. The question is what you'll do with it." The next 6 weeks blurred together in a chaos of phone calls, contracts, legal reviews, and logistics Claire had never imagined needing to understand. Mrs. McPherson connected her with Duncan Sinclair, an Edinburgh barrister who specialized in high-value estates and art law. Duncan, in turn, brought in authenticators from Christie's, conservators from the National Gallery, insurance specialists, and security consultants. The paintings were carefully transported to a secure facility in Edinburgh where experts examined every brushstroke, every canvas fiber, every aging marker that could verify or discredit their authenticity. Claire and Isla remained in the castle, living in their one heated room, waiting for news that would confirm the paintings were real or reveal this had all been a massive, cruel mistake. The first authentication came back in week 4. The Rembrandt was genuine. Provenance traced back to a documented 1710 sale from the Van Rijn family estate to a Dutch collector, then through 2 more owners before the MacGregor family acquired it in 1849. The painting was listed as lost during World War II in art databases, but there was no suggestion it had been stolen. The MacGregor family had legally owned it and legally hidden it. The second authentication confirmed the Vermeer. The third verified the Chardin. By week 6, all 7 paintings had been authenticated, conserved, and valued by multiple experts. Conservative total estimate, £270 million. Aggressive estimate, given market trends, £310 million. Christie's wanted to auction them as a collection, the discovery of the decade, possibly the century. They projected bidding that would set records. But first came the legal maze. Duncan Sinclair worked through Scottish property law, verified that Claire's inheritance of Killian Castle included all contents not specifically excluded, that Bowie's will clearly intended her to receive whatever she found, that the MacGregor family's legal heirs, traced to distant cousins in Australia and Canada, had no claim to property hidden then legally abandoned by their ancestors' dementia. The process cost £40,000 in legal fees. Claire had to borrow against the eventual sale, signing promissory notes that terrified her even as Duncan assured her they were necessary and manageable given the painting's value. Insurance alone cost £8,000 monthly while the authentication and conservation process continued. More debt, more promissory notes, more faith that this would eventually resolve into actual money rather than spectacular bankruptcy. Isla started school in the nearby village, riding a bus that picked her up at the end of the forest track. She made friends, adapted to Scottish accents, stopped asking when they were going home to Manchester. The castle became home in her mind, this broken place where they lived in one room but somehow had enough. Claire told her nothing about the paintings, nothing about millions, just that Mummy was handling some complicated business with the estate, that they'd be okay, that 6 months might turn into longer but that was fine. Christmas came cold and grey. Claire bought Isla presents from charity shops, wrapped them in paper covered with cartoon characters, tried to make the holiday feel normal. They ate dinner in front of the fireplace, the great hall warmed by logs Claire had scavenged from the forest, and Isla sang carols in her clear, high voice while Claire fought tears, thinking about how close they'd been to having nothing. January brought news from Christie's. The auction was scheduled for April. The catalogue would be extraordinary. Press coverage would be global. They expected bidding to exceed £300 million given the quality and rarity of the collection. Duncan walked Claire through the financial implications. After auction fees, 12%. After legal costs, approximately £200,000 total. After taxes, 40% on the proceeds. Claire would net approximately £160 million. The number had stopped having meaning months ago. £160 million was as incomprehensible as £270 million or £300 million. All of them represented amounts that couldn't fit in Claire's mental categories of wealth, that existed in a realm beyond anything she'd ever imagined possessing. "What do I do with that much money?" she asked Duncan one grey February afternoon in his Edinburgh office. "Whatever you want. Investments, property, philanthropy, savings for Isla's future. Most of my clients in your situation work with wealth management firms, established trusts, ensure the money generates income rather than simply sitting stagnant. Most of your clients didn't grow up in council houses eating pasta every meal." Duncan's expression softened. "No, they didn't. Which means you'll likely make better decisions than they do. Poverty teaches value in ways wealth never can." David Bowie's words echoed in Claire's mind. Poverty teaches humility. Desperation teaches what actually matters. The auction approached with mounting press coverage. Christie's released carefully curated information about a major discovery of lost masterworks found in Scotland, recovered from a private collection dispersed during World War II. They didn't name Claire or the castle's location, but speculation ran rampant online. Journalists called Mrs. Macpherson's office, showed up in the village asking questions. One particularly aggressive reporter tracked down the castle's location and knocked on the door, camera ready, before Duncan's security team escorted her off the property. Claire and Isla retreated deeper into isolation, stopped going to the village, ordered groceries delivered, hired a tutor for Isla rather than risk school pickup becoming a media circus. The night before the auction, Claire couldn't sleep. She descended to the wine cellar, stood in the empty space where the paintings had been hidden for 80 years. The vault stood open now, nothing inside but air and the ghost of extraordinary wealth. She thought about Ian McGregor, the man who'd hidden his family's collection to protect it from bombing and never remembered where he'd put it. About David Bowie, who'd searched for 12 years and found something he could have kept but chose to leave for someone who needed it more. About her mother, who'd been kind to a famous musician during a difficult creative period and never known that kindness would echo across decades to save her daughter. The auction happened by telephone and internet, bidders from around the world competing for pieces of art history. Claire listened from Duncan's office, watching numbers climb on a screen with the detachment of someone watching a movie about someone else's life. The Rembrandt sold for £42 million. The Vermeer for £51 million. The Chardin for £14 million. The Goya for £29 million. The Turner for £21 million. The Van Gogh for £68 million. The Picasso for £39 million. Total, £264 million. Lower than Christie's projections, but still extraordinary. Still life-changing. Still more money than Claire's brain could process as real. After fees and costs and taxes, the final transfer to her account would be £148 million. Duncan shook her hand with professional warmth. Congratulations, Miss Donovan. You're one of the wealthiest women in Scotland. Claire stared at the numbers on the screen. I don't feel different. You will. Give it time. The money arrived in her account on a Tuesday in late April. Claire checked her banking app, saw the balance, and felt absolutely nothing. The number was too large to register emotionally. It was just digits on a screen, abstract as astronomy. She bought a car. Nothing excessive. A reliable 3-year-old Volvo, similar to Mrs. Macpherson's. Paid cash. The dealership treated her with the deference reserved for people who could afford to pay £25,000 without financing. She hired contractors to repair Killian Castle properly. Not a quick fix, but a proper restoration. Historic environment Scotland approved. Duncan connected her with specialists who understood period architecture, who could restore the castle to functionality while preserving its character. The estimate was £2 million over 3 years. She established a trust for Isla. £40 million, managed by professionals, untouchable until Isla turned 25. Education, housing, living expenses would come from trust income. The principal would grow, compounding, ensuring security for generations. She paid off every debt. Her credit cards, her mother's medical bills, the loans she'd taken for legal fees. The total was £190,000. Writing checks that large felt surreal. She bought her mother's old council house in Manchester from the Housing Authority, paid £85,000 cash, renovated it completely, then donated it to a charity supporting single mothers, with the stipulation that it provide rent-free housing for families in crisis. The rest, £100 million, she put in conservative investments. Bonds, index funds, property-generating rental income. Her financial advisor promised returns of at least £4 million annually, more money than she could possibly spend, growing rather than diminishing. She kept working on the castle restoration, living in their one heated room, even though she could afford to rent a mansion. Isla asked occasionally why they didn't move somewhere nicer, warmer, newer. Claire explained they were seeing the restoration through, honoring the work Mr. Bowie had started, making sure the castle was preserved properly. The truth was simpler. The castle felt right. It was where she'd found the paintings, where her life had transformed. Moving felt like abandoning the story before it was complete. Duncan called in May with news that made Claire's blood run cold. The McGregor family cousins in Australia are filing a claim. They're arguing the paintings belong to their ancestor, that Ian McGregor's dementia meant he couldn't legally abandon them, that they should receive a substantial portion of the proceeds. Claire's hands shook. Can they win? Unlikely. The paintings were legally hidden during wartime, legally forgotten, legally discovered by David Bowie, who legally owned the property, who legally left it to you with clear intent. But the case could drag on for years. They're asking for 30% of the proceeds, approximately £80 million. The fear that should have consumed Claire never materialized. She'd expected this. Expected someone to try taking what she'd found. Expected the story to include betrayal and greed and legal battles. Fight it, she said. Use whatever resources necessary. I'm not giving them a penny. The case proceeded through Scottish courts over 6 months. The McGregor cousins presented arguments about family heritage, about their ancestors' intentions, about the unfairness of strangers profiting from family property. Duncan presented airtight documentation. Property law. Bowie's will. Authentication proving the paintings had been legally acquired by the original McGregor ancestors, legally hidden, legally forgotten, and legally abandoned when Ian McGregor's dementia prevented him from passing the information to his heirs. The judge ruled in Claire's favor completely. The paintings were discovered by Mr. Jones on property he owned. He left that property and all contents to Miss Donovan with clear intent. The McGregor family's tragic loss of institutional knowledge does not constitute a claim against legally transferred property. Case dismissed. The cousins appealed, lost again, finally gave up, though not without media interviews suggesting Claire was profiting from their family's misfortune. Claire ignored them. She'd learned something during the months of authentication and legal battles and waiting. Wealth attracted resentment. People who'd ignored her poverty were offended by her success. The judgment felt arbitrary and unfair, but it was reality nonetheless. She established the Margaret Donovan Foundation in October, naming it after her mother. Initial endowment, £30 million. Mission, supporting single mothers facing poverty, providing housing assistance, job training, childcare, the practical help that actually mattered when you were drowning. The first year helped 340 families. Modest numbers that felt more meaningful than the millions generating them. Every application Claire reviewed carried echoes of her own story. Women fleeing bad situations, struggling with medical debt, trying to provide for children while the world systematically failed them. One recipient was Elena Torres, 29, 2 children, living in her car after her husband's death from a work accident left her with debt the insurance company refused to cover. Elena's application arrived 6 months into the foundation's operation, and something in the spare language describing her situation made Claire request a meeting. They sat in the foundation's Edinburgh office, while Elena's children played in the room next door under a staff member's supervision. Elena's hands trembled holding tea, exhaustion written into every line of her posture. I don't do charity, but my kids need a place to sleep that isn't the back seat, and I can't get approved for an apartment without money I don't have. Claire saw herself in those words. This isn't charity. It's support while you rebuild. We'll cover security deposit, 2 months' rent, connect you with legal aid for the debt. We have childcare grants, so you can attend job training. Elena's facade cracked. Tears cutting tracks through makeup applied to hide exhaustion. Why would you do this? Because I lived in my car too. Different reasons, same fear. Someone helped me when I needed it most. Now I help others. That's how this works. The foundation placed Elena in a flat by December, enrolled her in nursing courses by January, provided 6 months of childcare support. Elena sent thank you notes monthly, updates on her progress, photographs of her children in their bedroom. Stories like Elena's accumulated. The foundation helped people, made differences Claire could measure and housed families in stable employment and children who didn't have to be afraid. The work felt more valuable than the money funding it, more real than numbers growing in investment accounts. Isla turned 8 in March. They celebrated with a party at the castle, which was nearly complete in its restoration. The great hall had been returned to something approaching glory. The kitchen was functional, heating was installed, windows were repaired. It looked like a castle should, historic but livable, beautiful but not ostentatious. Claire invited Isla's school friends, their families, and a few people who'd helped during the desperate early months. They ate cake and played games, and the castle filled with the sounds of children laughing, bringing life to stones that had been silent too long. Later, after the guests left, after Isla fell asleep in her bedroom, a real bedroom now, properly heated and decorated, Claire stood in the great hall and thought about transformation, about how one desperate search in a wine cellar had changed everything, about David Bowie's faith that she'd use wealth responsibly, about her mother's kindness echoing across decades. She kept the vault, had it restored, and moved to a place of honor in the castle study. Inside now, instead of paintings, she kept David Bowie's letter, her mother's photograph, and a copy of the Foundation's first-year report. The money had transformed her circumstances, but not her character. She still shopped carefully, still questioned expensive purchases, still felt guilty using heating liberally despite being able to afford any utility cost. Poverty had taught lessons that wealth couldn't erase, had shaped habits and values she didn't want to lose. Isla grew up understanding both her privilege and her responsibility. Claire taught her about the paintings, about Bowie's gift, about the Foundation's work. Taught her that having resources meant using them to help others, that wealth was stewardship rather than ownership. The castle became a place that mattered beyond its walls. The Foundation operated from the renovated barn buildings, employing 20 people, helping thousands of families annually. The grounds hosted events supporting single mothers, educational programs, community gatherings. 5 years after finding the paintings, Claire stood in the wine cellar one quiet afternoon. The space was clean now, properly lit, the walls restored. The sealed section remained open, a reminder of what had hidden there. She thought about Ian McGregor, hiding his family's collection to protect it from war. About the dementia that stole his memories, leaving the paintings lost for 80 years. About Bowie searching, finding, and leaving the discovery for someone who needed it desperately. About herself, counting 43 pounds on an Edinburgh street, certain she'd reached the end of options. The Foundation would continue after her death. She'd structured it carefully, ensuring the work survived transitions of leadership, funded by investments that would grow across generations. Monument to understanding that wealth without purpose was just numbers growing while meaning atrophied. Isla would inherit what remained. Claire had been careful about that too. Enough to ensure security, not so much that work became optional. Enough to build a life, not enough to coast through life meaninglessly. The castle was restored. The paintings were sold. The Foundation was thriving. And Claire, who'd started this journey desperate and homeless and frightened, had become someone who could help others through their desperate moments. She climbed the stairs from the wine cellar, emerged into late afternoon light streaming through windows that no longer leaked. Isla called from the kitchen, asking what was for dinner. Claire called back that they'd figure it out together, thinking about normal questions from a child who'd survived homelessness and now had security but remembered enough to understand how lucky they were. Outside, Scotland's weather was doing what Scotland's weather did. Rain approaching, clouds gathering, the landscape preparing for another storm. But the castle would hold. The roof was sound, the walls were solid, the foundation was true. They'd survived everything that had tried to break them, had found wealth where no one expected it, and had used that wealth to ensure others could survive their own breaking moments. That seemed like enough. Seemed like the proper end to a story that began with desperation and transformed into purpose through the unlikely intersection of a dead rock star's generosity, a forgotten painting collection, and one woman's willingness to search when searching seemed pointless. The rain began. Claire closed windows, started dinner, called Isla to help set the table. They ate together in the kitchen while the storm hammered the castle's walls and the heating kept them warm, and the Foundation's work continued helping people who needed help desperately. Wealth had changed their circumstances but not who they were, had given them security but not erased the memory of insecurity, had provided resources but not removed the responsibility to use those resources wisely. David Bowie's letter had been right. Wealth revealed character rather than creating it. Claire had been brave when she had 43 pounds. Now she was brave with millions. The number changed, but she didn't. And that, finally, was the actual treasure. Not the paintings worth 270 million pounds, but the understanding that who you are matters more than what you have. That kindness compounds across decades. That desperation teaches what actually matters. That some gifts hide in wine cellars waiting for the right person, at the right time, desperate enough to search and humble enough to use what they find properly. The storm passed. The castle stood. And in the morning, Claire would wake up and do the work that mattered, helping one more family, making one more difference, proving that David Bowie's faith hadn't been misplaced. But the morning brought something unexpected. A knock on the castle door at 7 o'clock, insistent enough to wake both Claire and Isla. Claire descended the stairs cautiously, aware that early morning visitors rarely brought good news. Through the window, she recognized the silhouette. Douglas, the contractor who'd opened the wine cellar wall 2 years ago, who'd fled when he saw what was inside, who'd made her promise he was never there. She opened the door. Douglas looked older, thinner, carrying the weight of something he'd been holding too long. "Miss Donovan, I know I said I didn't want to be involved, but I need to tell you something. About the castle. About what Mr. Bowie actually intended." Claire stepped aside, let him enter. They sat in the great hall where morning light streamed through windows that finally deserved the light. Douglas turned his cap in his hands, clearly struggling with where to begin. "I worked for Mr. Bowie. Not just that one repair job I told you about. From 1985 until he died. He hired me to maintain this castle, to keep it standing, to protect what was inside without ever telling me exactly what I was protecting." Claire felt the ground shift beneath her understanding of everything. "You knew about the paintings?" "No. He never told me that specifically. But I knew there was something in the wine cellar. Something he checked on every time he visited. He'd go down alone, stay for hours, come back up looking. I don't know how to describe it. Satisfied, like he confirmed something important was still safe." Douglas pulled a letter from his jacket pocket, the paper worn from being carried for years. "He gave me this 3 months before he died. Said if I ever found out what was in the wine cellar, if anyone ever claimed the castle and discovered it, I should give them this letter. He paid me £50,000 to keep the castle maintained after his death, to wait for whoever inherited it, to give them this when the time was right." He handed Claire the letter. The handwriting was unmistakably Bowie's, the same script from the letter she'd found in the vault. "To Claire, if Douglas is giving you this, you found what I left. You've opened the vault. You've discovered wealth beyond anything your mother or I could have imagined when she worked for me in Switzerland. I need you to understand something crucial about why I chose you. Your mother was 8 months pregnant when she worked on the outside sessions. The recording company treated her terribly, long hours, no proper breaks, dismissive of her needs. I tried to intervene, tried to ensure she was compensated fairly, given proper rest. I failed. My influence wasn't enough to override their cruelty. She left Switzerland early, exhausted and frightened, and I never forgave myself for not protecting her better. I tried to find her afterward, wanted to send money, support, something to acknowledge how poorly she'd been treated. But she disappeared into Manchester's working-class anonymity. I couldn't locate her without resources that would have felt invasive, stalkerish. So I waited, hoped someday I'd cross paths with her again. In 2010, I found her obituary. Cancer. Only 49. I realized I'd waited too long. Failed her twice, once during the sessions, once by not trying harder to find her and help. Then I saw your name in the obituary. Margaret Donovan is survived by her daughter Claire and granddaughter Isla. I researched you carefully, found you'd worked as a museum archivist, understood history and preservation. Found you'd married, divorced, fallen on difficult times. You were the person I should have helped originally. Your mother's daughter. Someone who would understand that the paintings I found weren't just wealth, but responsibility. Someone poor enough to need them desperately, educated enough to handle them properly, principled enough not to waste them selfishly. I'm leaving this castle and its contents to you not as charity, but as payment of a debt I owed your mother. She was kind when everyone else was cruel. She worked despite being pregnant and exhausted. She never complained, never demanded better treatment, simply did her job with grace. I failed to protect her then. I'm protecting you now, the only way I can from beyond death. Use the wealth to honor her memory. Help others the way I should have helped her. Don't let money corrupt you into becoming the kind of person who treated your mother poorly. Stay who you are, desperate enough to search, humble enough to use what you find properly. This is my apology to Margaret, delivered through you. Make it mean something. David. Claire's hands trembled as she set the letter down. All this time, she'd understood the inheritance as random kindness from a rock star who'd briefly known her mother. But it was more complicated than that. It was guilt and grief, and a debt that couldn't be paid to the person who was owed it, so Bowie had paid it forward to the next generation. He talked about your mother sometimes, Douglas said quietly. During the years I worked for him, he'd mentioned this pregnant woman who'd worked for him once, who'd been treated badly, who he'd failed to help. It bothered him more than you'd think. He was rich and famous and could do almost anything, but he couldn't fix that one mistake. Couldn't go back and make those recording company executives treat her decently. She never told me, Claire whispered. Never mentioned working for him was difficult. She just said it was a brief job in Switzerland before I was born. That it paid well. That Mr. Bowie was kind. She protected you from knowing how badly she'd been treated. That's what parents do. They shield their children from the worst of their struggles. Claire thought about her own months of homelessness, how she tried to make it seem like an adventure for Isla, how she'd never let her daughter see the full extent of their desperation. The pattern repeated across generations. Mothers protecting children from truths too heavy for small shoulders. Thank you for telling me, she said finally, and for keeping the castle maintained, for honoring your promise to him. Douglas stood, clearly relieved to have finally delivered the message he'd carried for years. He was a good man. Complicated, but good. He cared about people in ways that money couldn't always fix, and that bothered him. I think leaving you the paintings was his way of finally fixing something. After Douglas left, Claire sat alone with Bowie's second letter, understanding her inheritance more completely. This wasn't random kindness. It was targeted justice. Payment to someone who'd worked while pregnant and exhausted, delivered to that person's daughter who was now struggling with her own child. The weight of that intention settled into her bones. She wasn't just managing wealth. She was honoring a debt, completing a transaction that had started before she was born, when her mother had chosen grace under impossible circumstances. She thought about the foundation's work, about the 340 families helped in year one, about Elena Torres and the others whose stories echoed Claire's own, about how many of them were mothers, pregnant or with young children, trying to survive systems that didn't care about their exhaustion or their fear. Bowie's debt to Margaret had become Claire's responsibility to other women in similar situations. The inheritance wasn't about her. It was about them. About using what she'd found to prevent other mothers from dying young with unpaid debts and unmet needs, other daughters from growing up without support. The foundation's mission sharpened in her mind. Not just housing assistance and job training, but specific support for pregnant women and new mothers. Childcare that actually met their needs. Medical care that didn't bankrupt them. Advocacy for fair treatment in workplaces that viewed pregnancy as inconvenience. Margaret Donovan hadn't needed charity. She'd needed justice. Fair compensation, reasonable accommodations, basic human decency. And when she didn't get it, when the systems failed her, she survived anyway. Raised Claire alone, worked herself into early exhaustion, died with debts that shouldn't have existed. Claire wouldn't let that pattern continue. Not with the resources she now possessed. She called her foundation director, Emma Sullivan, a woman who'd spent 20 years in social work before Claire hired her to run operations. Emma arrived within an hour, sensing the urgency in Claire's voice. They sat in the study where Claire had moved the empty vault, now a memorial to transformation. Claire shared Bowie's second letter, explained the deeper context of her inheritance. Emma read carefully, her expression shifting as she understood. This changes everything. We've been treating symptoms, housing insecurity, unemployment, debt. But the root cause for many of our families is pregnancy and early motherhood, driving them into poverty because workplaces and healthcare systems fail them systematically. Exactly. My mother worked while 8 months pregnant because she needed the money. They treated her badly because they could. She survived it, but it damaged her. Started the cascade that led to her early death. I want to prevent that for other women. They spent the next 3 hours designing new programs. Prenatal care stipends, paid maternity leave for women whose employers didn't provide it, child care starting from infancy rather than waiting until children were older, legal advocacy for workplace discrimination cases, medical debt relief specifically for pregnancy and birth-related costs. The expanded programs would cost an additional £5 million annually. Claire had the money. More than enough. The question was whether she had the will to fight systems that resisted change. She had the will. The Margaret Donovan Foundation announced the new initiatives in June. The response was immediate and overwhelming. Applications flooded in. Women who'd been working while pregnant, who'd faced discrimination, who'd accumulated medical debt they couldn't escape, who'd lost jobs because they needed time for newborn care. The first expanded program recipient was Sophie Chen, 27, fired from her accounting position after requesting unpaid leave for premature twin births. Sophie's application arrived with documentation of her termination, medical bills exceeding £45,000, and eviction notices for an apartment she could no longer afford. Claire interviewed Sophie personally, something she did for cases that particularly resonated. They met in the Foundation's Edinburgh office, while Sophie's twins slept in carriers, tiny and fragile, born at 32 weeks, and finally released from hospital care. "I worked until the day they were born," Sophie said, her voice carrying exhaustion that went bone deep. "My contractions started during a client meeting. I finished the meeting, drove myself to hospital, gave birth 4 hours later. Called my employer the next day to explain I'd need at least 2 weeks off. They fired me for abandoning my position without notice." Claire felt rage crystallize in her chest. This was what had happened to her mother. Different details, same systematic cruelty. Women punished for biology, for needing time to recover from literally creating human life. "The Foundation will cover your medical debt completely. We'll provide housing assistance for 6 months while you find new employment. We'll cover childcare costs for 2 years. And we'll connect you with an employment lawyer who specializes in pregnancy discrimination cases." Sophie's composure cracked. "Why? You don't know me. Why would you do this?" "Because it happened to my mother. She survived it, but she shouldn't have had to survive it. It should never have happened. I have resources now to ensure it happens to fewer women. That's what this money is for." The Foundation placed Sophie in a flat by July, paid her medical debt by August, connected her with a lawyer who filed a discrimination case that settled for £85,000 by September. Sophie used the settlement to start her own accounting consultancy, specializing in helping small businesses navigate payroll and taxes. 2 years later, she employed 12 people, 8 of them working mothers who needed flexible schedules. Stories like Sophie's accumulated. The Foundation helped 180 women in Year 2 through the pregnancy-focused programs. Year 3 brought 340 more. The numbers felt inadequate compared to the scale of the problem. Thousands of women facing similar cruelty annually across the UK, but each case represented a life stabilized, a family prevented from collapsing. Claire poured money into advocacy as well. Funded research documenting pregnancy discrimination's economic impact. Supported legislative efforts to strengthen workplace protections. Partnered with medical organizations to subsidize prenatal care for women without insurance. The work consumed her in ways that felt meaningful rather than exhausting. Every woman helped was a debt paid toward her mother's memory. Every system changed was a small victory against the cruelty Margaret had faced. Isla grew up watching this work, understanding that wealth carried obligations beyond comfortable living. She volunteered at the Foundation during school holidays, processed applications, interviewed families, learned to see people rather than cases. At 13, Isla asked the question Claire had been waiting for. "Mum, why do you work so hard when we already have more money than we could ever spend?" They were sitting in the castle's library, a room Claire had restored with particular care because her mother had loved books. Late afternoon light filtered through windows, casting everything in amber. "Because your grandmother worked herself into an early grave, and I have the resources to prevent that from happening to other women. Because a man I never met felt guilty about failing to help her, and he left me wealth specifically to honor her memory. Because having money means nothing if you don't use it for something that matters." Isla processed this with the seriousness she brought to difficult concepts. So the paintings were never really ours. They were payment for what happened to Grandma Margaret. In a way, yes. David Bowie found something extraordinary and could have kept it. Instead, he left it for someone who would use it properly. He trusted me to complete a transaction he couldn't complete himself, treating your grandmother fairly, supporting her, helping her survive something that shouldn't have required survival. Did Grandma know about Mr. Bowie feeling bad about how she was treated? No, she never knew. She died before he could make it right. That's why it fell to me. I'm finishing something they started before I was born. Isla was quiet for a long moment, studying a photograph of Margaret on the library shelf. A young woman, barely 25, holding infant Claire, looking exhausted and determined. I want to help, Isla said finally. Not just volunteering sometimes, but actually help. When I'm older, I want to run the foundation or something like it. Continue what you started. Claire felt something loosen in her chest, a fear she'd been carrying without acknowledging. That Isla would grow up spoiled by wealth, disconnected from why it mattered, unable to understand that privilege came with responsibility. But Isla understood. At 13, she already understood. You'll need education, Claire said. University, probably graduate work, social work or public policy, or nonprofit management. Understanding the systems we're trying to change. I know. I've been thinking about it. UCL has a program in social policy. I could start there. 5 years in the future telescoped into present relevance. Isla at 18, heading to university, carrying forward work that had started with her grandmother's poorly treated pregnancy, that had been honored by a rock star's guilt, that had transformed Claire's desperation into purpose. The chain held. The values transmitted. The work continued. Year 5 of the Foundation's operation brought unexpected challenges. A recession hit the UK, driving more families into crisis, overwhelming demand for services while investment returns declined, reducing funding available. Claire had structured the foundation conservatively, but even conservative planning struggled when the economy collapsed. She called Emma for a financial review in November, as winter settled over Scotland and heating costs soared for families already struggling. The numbers were sobering. Investment returns down 18% year over year. Applications up 40%. The Foundation's annual budget of £8 million was inadequate to meet demand. They were turning away families who qualified for help, limiting aid to crisis intervention levels rather than the comprehensive support that actually produced lasting stability. We need to expand the endowment, Emma said bluntly. Another £20 million would generate enough additional income to meet current demand and prepare for future growth. Claire had been expecting this, had known that £100 million, however vast it seemed, would eventually prove insufficient against systemic poverty scale. The question was whether she was willing to commit more personal wealth to a problem that wouldn't be solved in her lifetime. She thought about her mother, who'd given everything until there was nothing left, who died with debts and exhaustion and no safety net despite working 3 jobs, who'd never had the option of preserving wealth for personal comfort because survival consumed every resource. I'll transfer £30 million, Claire said. That should cover expansion and create buffer for future economic downturns. Emma's expression carried relief and something deeper, recognition that some people understood wealth as responsibility rather than accumulation. That's extraordinarily generous. Are you certain? That's a substantial portion of your remaining assets. I'm certain. The money was never really mine. It was payment for a debt owed to my mother. I'm just the mechanism for distributing it properly. The transfer happened within a week. The Foundation's endowment grew to £130 million. Investment income increased to approximately £6 million annually, allowing expanded operations, new programs, regional offices beyond Edinburgh, partnerships with organizations doing similar work across the UK. Year 6 helped 580 families. Year 7, 720. The numbers grew while the work stayed focused, helping women facing pregnancy discrimination, providing comprehensive support rather than temporary bandages, changing systems rather than just treating symptoms. Claire turned 43 in Year 8. Isla was 18, preparing for university, having been accepted to UCL's social policy program. The castle restoration was complete, the structure transformed into something beautiful while preserving its historical character. The foundation operated efficiently, helping nearly 1,000 families annually. On paper, Claire's life looked like a success story. Homeless single mother discovers fortune, uses it to help others, raises conscious daughter, achieve security and purpose. The narrative arc was complete, satisfying, ready for epilogue. But Claire felt something missing. A hollow space that wealth hadn't filled, that work hadn't addressed, that time hadn't healed. She mentioned it to Dr. Ellen Fraser, the therapist she'd started seeing in year 4 when panic attacks began disrupting her sleep. Sessions that had initially focused on processing trauma from homelessness had evolved into deeper exploration of identity, purpose, and the psychological aftermath of sudden wealth. "I have everything I thought I wanted," Claire said during a September session. "Security, purpose, the ability to help others. Isla is thriving. The foundation is succeeding. But I feel empty, like I'm going through motions rather than actually living." Dr. Fraser leaned forward slightly, the gesture she made when approaching something significant. "What do you think you're missing?" "Connection. Real connection. Everyone I interact with now knows about the money. It colors everything. I can't tell if people like me or like what I can provide. I can't date because men either resent my wealth or want access to it. I can't make friends because friendship feels transactional. Am I being cultivated for donation potential?" You're describing isolation that often accompanies sudden wealth. The money creates barriers, even while solving practical problems. I thought having resources would make life easier. And it did materially. But emotionally, socially, it made everything more complicated. I miss being invisible. I miss people judging me on who I am rather than what I have. Dr. Fraser was quiet for a moment, letting Claire sit with her own words. What would you do if money wasn't a factor? The question stopped Claire cold. She'd spent 8 years making decisions through the lens of wealth, how to use it, protect it, distribute it responsibly. She'd forgotten how to think about what she actually wanted beyond financial categories. "I don't know," she admitted. "I don't remember how to want things just because they'd make me happy rather than because they'd help others or honor my mother's memory or fulfill some obligation. That's what we need to work on. Reconnecting you with desires that are about Claire, not Claire the inheritor, or Claire the foundation director, or Claire the single mother. Just Claire, whoever she is beneath all those roles." The work proved harder than Claire expected. 8 years of defining herself through responsibility and obligation had created patterns difficult to break. She'd become someone who measured value and impact rather than personal satisfaction, who couldn't justify spending money or time on things that didn't obviously help others. Dr. Fraser assigned homework. Small pleasures pursued for no reason beyond enjoyment. A painting class, a hiking group, a book club that discussed fiction rather than policy papers. Activities that served no purpose except making Claire happy. Claire resisted initially. The suggestions felt frivolous compared to foundation work. But she forced herself to try, attending a watercolor painting class in Stirling, feeling awkward and out of place among hobbyists discussing brush techniques and color theory. The class met Tuesday evenings in a converted mill, taught by a woman named Fiona who was 60-something and spoke about painting with the passion most people reserved for religion. Claire arrived late, frazzled from a foundation emergency call, expecting to observe rather than participate. Fiona handed her a brush. "We're doing landscapes today. Don't think, just paint what you feel about the scene." Claire stared at the blank paper, mind spinning through 1,000 reasons this was absurd. She didn't have time for painting, didn't have talent, should be using these 2 hours for foundation work or Isla or literally anything more productive. But the brush was in her hand, and Fiona was watching with patient expectation, and Claire found herself making a mark on paper. Then another, colors bleeding together in ways she couldn't control, creating something that wasn't good but was undeniably hers. 2 hours passed without her noticing. She left with a painting that was technically terrible but emotionally honest, a castle in darkness with one lit window, surrounded by forests that felt more protective than threatening. She went back the next week, and the week after. By month 3, she completed 6 paintings, none of them skilled, but all of them revealing something about her interior landscape that words couldn't access. The hiking group was similarly transformative. 8 people who met Sunday mornings to walk Scotland's hills, talking about nothing important, enjoying movement and landscape and the simple pleasure of being alive outside. No one in the group knew about Claire's money. She was just another middle-aged woman who liked walking and didn't talk much. They accepted her at face value, asked about her week without expecting detailed answers, included her in group photos and post-hike pub visits without making it feel obligatory. After 3 months, Claire realized she'd made friends. Actual friends. Sarah, a teacher. Marcus, a programmer. June, who ran a dog grooming business. People who liked her company without wanting anything beyond her presence. When June's car broke down, Claire's first instinct was to offer to buy her a new one. She caught herself, heard Dr. Fraser's voice reminding her that friends didn't solve each other's problems with money. Instead, she offered June a ride to work for the week. Small help, human scale, the kind of assistance that built connection rather than created dependency. The experience of having friends who weren't connected to wealth, who knew nothing about paintings or foundations or inheritance, who just wanted to walk hills and complain about weather and share mediocre pub food. It was healing in ways Claire hadn't anticipated. She was learning to be Claire again. Not Claire Donovan, inheritor of David Bowie's wealth. Not Claire Donovan, foundation director. Just Claire, a woman who liked hiking and painting badly and discussing books that didn't matter. A person with dimensions beyond responsibility. Isla noticed the change. "You seem lighter," she observed one evening after Claire returned from hiking. "Less like you're carrying the weight of the world. I'm learning that I don't have to carry everything. That sometimes it's okay to just exist without purpose beyond existence. Dr. Fraser's therapy is working then. Eventually. It took me months to stop feeling guilty about spending time on things that only made me happy." Isla smiled. "You're allowed to be happy, Mum. Grandma would want that. Mr. Bowie would want that. The whole point of the money was giving you freedom, not shackling you to obligation." The words landed with uncomfortable accuracy. Claire had transformed wealth into a new kind of poverty of joy, of spontaneity, of permission to simply live. She'd been so focused on using money responsibly that she'd forgotten responsibility included responsibility to herself. Year 9 brought the 10-year anniversary of finding the paintings. The foundation organized a celebration, inviting families they'd helped, donors, staff, volunteers. The event filled the castle's great hall with people whose lives had been transformed by work funded by art found in a wine cellar. Elena Torres spoke, the first recipient Claire had interviewed personally. 10 years ago, I was living in my car with 2 children, convinced we'd never have stability. The foundation gave us housing, support, hope. Now I'm a nurse, my children are thriving, and I've bought my first home. None of that would have been possible without Miss Donovan's vision. Other women shared similar stories. Families pulled back from the edge. Children who'd grown up stable rather than desperate. Futures transformed by comprehensive support rather than temporary assistance. Claire listened to the testimonials and felt the weight of accomplished purpose. This was what the money was for. This was why Bowie had left the inheritance to someone desperate enough to understand need from experience. But she also felt something else. A question forming beneath the satisfaction. If the foundation's work could continue without her direct involvement, if she'd built something sustainable that would outlast her life, what came next for Claire personally? Isla was leaving for university in 3 weeks. The castle would be empty except for Claire. The foundation ran efficiently under Emma's direction. Claire's role had become more symbolic than operational. She approved budgets, attended events, met with major recipients, but the daily work happened without her. She was 43, healthy, financially secure beyond any reasonable need. Her daughter was launched. Her mother's memory was honored. Her obligations were fulfilled. What did Claire want for herself? The question terrified her more than homelessness had. At least homelessness had come with clear problems requiring immediate solutions. This was the terror of unlimited options, of freedom she didn't know how to use. Dr. Fraser smiled when Claire brought this to therapy. "This is progress. You've moved from survival to security to purpose. Now you're ready for the final transition, from purpose to fulfillment. From living for others to living for yourself without guilt." "I don't know how to do that." No one does initially. That's why this is the hardest phase. Everything before had clear metrics. Now you have to decide what makes Claire happy beyond helping others, beyond honoring obligations. What do you want? Claire sat with the question for weeks. Tried painting answers, but the images never clarified. Walked hills hoping revelation would arrive with elevation. Waited for something obvious to present itself. The answer came from an unexpected source. A letter arrived in October, forwarded by Mrs. Macpherson from someone claiming to be David Bowie's former assistant. The letter was hesitant, apologetic, asking if Claire would be willing to meet to discuss Mr. Bowie's time at the castle. Claire agreed to a meeting, curiosity overriding caution. The woman who appeared at the castle 2 weeks later was in her 70s, elegant in the way of people who'd spent decades around celebrities, carrying herself with refined confidence. "Miss Donovan, thank you for seeing me. I'm Helena Archer. I worked for David from 1981 until 1999, managing his personal affairs, properties, various projects. I heard about the painting's discovery, about the foundation's work. I wanted to meet you, to share something about David's relationship with this castle. They settled in the library, Helena accepting tea with practiced grace. David loved this place. It was his refuge from fame, from pressure, from the constant demands of being David Bowie. He'd come here for weeks at a time, recording nothing, writing nothing, just existing. Walking the grounds, reading, painting. Did you know he painted?" Claire shook her head. "He was quite good. Not famous artist good, but genuinely talented. The castle's isolation let him create without anyone knowing, without expectations or critics, or the weight of his own legend. He could be just David Jones here, a man making art for the joy of making it rather than for commercial release." Helena pulled a photograph from her bag. Bowie, probably mid-40s, standing in the castle's great hall with paint on his hands and a smile that looked genuinely happy rather than performatively charming. This was taken in 1991. He'd spent 3 weeks here doing nothing but painting landscapes. He never showed them to anyone, never tried to sell them. Just made them because the process brought him joy. He told me once that this castle was the only place he felt free to be mediocre, to create without the burden of genius. Claire studied the photograph, seeing something she recognized, someone trapped by their own success, by wealth that had solved material problems while creating new psychological ones. "Why are you telling me this?" Helena's expression softened. "Because I've followed your foundation's work. I've seen how seriously you take the responsibility of the inheritance. And I worry you're making the same mistake David made, letting responsibility consume joy. He spent decades being David Bowie, fulfilling expectations, using wealth responsibly, supporting causes. But he forgot how to just be David. This castle reminded him. I'm hoping it can remind you too." After Helena left, Claire sat alone in the library, thinking about Bowie painting badly in the Great Hall, creating for process rather than product, allowing himself mediocrity as an antidote to the pressure of being exceptional. She'd spent 9 years trying to be exceptional. Exceptional in generosity, in responsibility, in honoring obligations. She'd forgotten that sometimes being ordinary was its own form of freedom. The next Tuesday, at painting class, Fiona critiqued Claire's work with her usual bluntness. "This is technically deficient. Your perspective is wrong. Your colors are muddy, your brushwork is heavy-handed. But it's alive. It has energy. You're painting honestly rather than skillfully, which is more valuable. Should I take lessons? Improve my technique?" Fiona studied her carefully. "Why do you want to paint?" "I don't know. It makes me happy." Then improvement is optional. If you wanted to sell paintings or hang them in galleries, technique would matter. But if you're painting because it brings you joy, who cares if it's technically deficient? Make your muddy, heavy-handed paintings and enjoy the process. Permission to be mediocre felt revolutionary. Claire had spent her entire life trying to be good enough student, good enough employee, good enough mother, good enough inheritor of extraordinary wealth. The idea that some things could just be enjoyed without requiring excellence was foreign and liberating. She started painting more. Badly. Joyfully. Made terrible landscapes of Scotland's hills. Worse portraits of Isla. Abstract pieces that didn't represent anything beyond color and movement and the pleasure of making marks on paper. She kept exactly none of them. Created, observed, and destroyed. The point was process, not product. Permission to make without keeping, to enjoy without justifying, to exist without producing value. Isla, visiting from university for Christmas, found Claire painting in the Great Hall one afternoon. "Those are awful, Mum." "I know. Isn't it wonderful?" Her daughter laughed, understanding something that had taken Claire 9 years to learn. "You're finally happy. Not just satisfied with doing good work, but actually happy. Claire considered this. I think I am. Finally. It only took a decade and a fortune and extensive therapy to get here. Most people never get there at all. The foundation celebrated its 10th anniversary in year 10. The endowment had grown to £145 million through careful investment and Claire's additional contributions. Annual programs helped approximately 1,200 families. Success rates remained strong. 78% of families achieved stable housing and employment within 12 months of support ending. The Margaret Donovan Foundation had become exactly what Claire had envisioned. A sustainable operation that would continue helping women facing pregnancy discrimination and poverty long after Claire was gone. Her mother's memory honored through action rather than just sentiment. Claire, at 44, had achieved every reasonable goal. Isla thrived at university. The foundation succeeded beyond initial projections. The castle stood restored. Wealth was preserved and deployed responsibly. And Claire, finally, was learning to paint badly and hike hills and read books that meant nothing and be happy without guilt. The story could end there. Satisfying resolution. Obligations fulfilled. Purpose achieved. Freedom earned. But one afternoon in March, 11 years after finding the paintings, Claire descended to the wine cellar. She did this occasionally, standing in the space where everything changed, remembering the desperate search that had revealed what time had hidden. The vault still stood open in the study, but the wine cellar itself remained as she'd left it after removing the paintings. Restored, clean, empty of everything except memory. She walked the length of it slowly, hand-trailing along stones the McGregor family had laid in the 1880s. Reached the far end where the sealed wall had stood. Noticed something she'd never registered before. The floor. The stones beneath, where the vault had sat, were different from the surrounding floor. Darker. Fitted with different mortar. As if something larger had once occupied that space, and the vault had been installed later, on top of something else. Claire knelt, running her fingers along the seams. Felt the slight depression, the difference in surface texture. This floor section was a covering. Something existed beneath it. Her heart rate increased. She told herself this was absurd. The space had been thoroughly examined during the painting authentication. Nothing else could be hidden here. But the floor was definitely different. She called Douglas, who arrived within an hour, bringing tools and the same resignation he'd carried when opening the wall 11 years ago. "You think there's more?" he asked, studying the floor with a contractor's experienced eye. "I don't know, but the floor is different here, installed separately from the rest. Maybe it's nothing. Maybe I'm seeing patterns that don't exist." Douglas tested the stones, tapping, listening, feeling for hollow spaces. "There's definitely something underneath. Whether it's another room or just Victorian-era drainage, I can't say without opening it." "Open it!" The work took 3 hours. Removing stones revealed a wooden hatch, similar to the one in the original hidden room. No lock this time, just iron hinges and a handle worn smooth by hands that had opened it long ago. Claire pulled it up. Below, stone steps descended into darkness. Not a vault this time, but a passage, leading somewhere deeper into the mountain beneath the castle. Douglas shined his flashlight into the opening. The passage ran at least 50 feet before the light couldn't penetrate further. Stone walls, carved deliberately, leading into the earth. "The castle's built into the mountainside," he said quietly. "This passage could extend quite far. The Victorians sometimes built these for cold storage or whiskey aging. Could be natural caves they modified. Could be nothing at all." Claire stared into the darkness, feeling history pull at her. 11 years ago, she descended stairs into a wine cellar and found wealth beyond imagining. Now another passage waited, leading to something unknown. She could close the hatch, seal the floor, leave whatever existed down there undisturbed. She'd found enough, received more than anyone could reasonably expect. There was no need to keep searching. But the passage existed, and Claire had learned something during her years of therapy and painting and hiking. Sometimes searching wasn't about finding treasure, but about satisfying curiosity, pursuing questions because the questions themselves mattered. "I'm going down," she said. Douglas looked uncertain. "Miss Donovan, this could be dangerous. These old passages aren't always stable." "Then I'll be careful." She descended slowly, flashlight cutting through darkness that felt older than the castle itself. The passage walls showed different construction than the wine cellar, cruder, older, possibly medieval rather than Victorian. Someone had carved this tunnel centuries ago, for purposes lost to time. The passage ran 50 feet, then opened into a natural cave. Approximately 20 feet across, the ceiling disappeared into shadows beyond her light's reach. The space felt different from the wine cellar, colder, more ancient, touched by human hands but fundamentally wild. And in the center, carved into the cave's floor, was text. Claire knelt, brushing away centuries of dust. The words were in Latin, carved deeply enough to survive erosion. Her university Latin was rusty, but she could translate slowly. Here rests the truth that wealth cannot buy. Here lies the knowledge that time cannot erase. Here remains the promise that death cannot break. Below the text, a date, 1563. The year the castle was built. Claire sat back, mind spinning. This space predated the Victorian wine cellar, predated the castle itself. The builders in 1563 had found natural caves and incorporated them into the structure, carving cryptic messages for future discoverers. She explored further, flashlight revealing more text carved into the walls. Names, presumably the MacGregor family members who'd built the castle. Dates marking births and deaths. And one phrase, repeated along the cave's perimeter like a mantra. What we build stands. What we honor lives. What we remember survives. No treasure this time. No paintings or gold or anything with monetary value. Just words carved by people who'd been dead for 5 centuries, asserting their existence against time's erosion. Claire stood in the center of the cave, surrounded by names of people she'd never know, who'd built the castle she'd inherited, who'd carved promises that death couldn't break. The space felt sacred not because it held wealth, but because it held memory. Proof that people lived and loved, and worried about being forgotten. She climbed back to the wine cellar, blinking in the LED light after the cave's absolute darkness. Douglas waited anxiously. What was down there? Nothing, Claire said, then corrected herself. Everything. A cave. Text carved by the castle's builders. Their names, their dates, their hope that they'd be remembered. No treasure, just the treasure of knowing they existed. Douglas looked relieved it wasn't more paintings. What will you do with it? Leave it. Seal the floor again. It doesn't need to be shared. Sometimes things are valuable precisely because they stay hidden, because they remain private. The cave is for the MacGregor family, and whoever finds it after I'm gone. I'm not the only inheritor of this place. I'm just one person in a chain stretching back to 1563 and forward to people not yet born. They restored the floor over the following days, covering the hatch, making the wine cellar whole again. Claire told no one about the cave except Isla, who understood that some secrets should remain secrets. The discovery changed nothing practical about Claire's life. No new wealth, no additional responsibilities, just the knowledge that beneath the castle where she'd found fortune, there existed spaces that held something more fundamental, human beings asserting their existence against inevitable erasure. It felt appropriate somehow. The first discovery had transformed circumstances. The second discovery transformed perspective. Wealth had given Claire security. Memory gave her humility. Isla graduated from UCL with honors in social policy. Joined the Margaret Donovan Foundation as a program coordinator, bringing fresh energy and ideas while respecting the work's established foundation. She was brilliant, compassionate, and completely unspoiled by wealth. Proof that Claire had managed to transmit values across generations despite fears of corruption. On Isla's 25th birthday, the trust Claire had established matured. £40 million transferred to her daughter's control. Claire watched Isla handle the transition with maturity beyond her years, immediately placing half in continued trust, establishing her own foundation focused on educational equity, using wealth as tool rather than defining characteristic. The pattern held. The values transmitted. The work continued. Claire, at 50, finally stopped working on the foundation's operational details. Transitioned to emeritus director, attending board meetings but leaving daily operations to Emma and Isla. Spent more time painting, hiking, reading books that meant nothing, being Claire rather than Claire the inheritor. She found what Dr. Fraser called fulfillment, the ability to live for herself without guilt, to enjoy existence without requiring it to produce obvious value. Still helped people through foundation work, but no longer used that work to justify her own existence. She'd survived homelessness, found fortune, built something meaningful, raised a conscious daughter, honored her mother's memory, completed the debt David Bowie had left her to repay. And now, finally, she was free. Not free from responsibility, that never entirely disappeared, but free to exist without constantly proving she deserved the inheritance, without measuring every moment against obligation. The castle stood. The foundation thrived. Isla flourished. Margaret's memory lived in work that helped thousands of women. David Bowie's guilt had been transformed into justice, imperfect but real. And Claire, who'd started this journey desperate and frightened and counting 43 pounds on an Edinburgh street, had become someone who could paint badly and hike hills and sit in caves carved by people who'd been dead 500 years, feeling connected to something larger than money or status or any single life's accomplishments. That seemed like enough. Seemed like the proper end to a story that began with desperation and transformed into purpose through unlikely intersection of guilt and need and hidden paintings, waiting for someone humble enough to search when searching seemed pointless. The Margaret Donovan Foundation would continue long after Claire was gone, would help thousands more families, would prevent countless women from dying young with unpaid debts like Margaret had, would honor David Bowie's complex intentions, the guilt and the hope and the understanding that wealth mattered less than what you did with it. And beneath the castle, in a cave carved in 1563, names remained carved in stone. Proof that people lived and loved and worried about erasure. Proof that some things survived not through wealth, but through the simple act of asserting existence. Claire understood now what the cave's carvers had understood. What we build stands. What we honor lives. What we remember survives. She built a foundation, honored her mother, remembered that poverty taught lessons wealth couldn't buy. That was legacy enough. Thank you so much for watching until the end. If you love this story, check out the other videos on your screen now. I think you'll really enjoy them. And don't forget to subscribe if you haven't already. See you in the next story.